It is the spring of 1347. The palace of Vijayanagara rises from the Deccan Plateau like a monument to power, its courtyards alive with the sound of peacocks and the chime of temple bells. Inside the zenana, the women's quarters, it is silent. A girl named Malini sits on the edge of a stone platform, her feet dangling above marble floors so polished they reflect her face like water. She is 14 years old. 12 hours ago, she arrived here as the bride of a prince she met for the first time at the wedding ceremony. Her small hands are stained with henna in intricate patterns, each line a promise she did not make. The silk of her bridal sari is so heavy it feels like chains.
A maidservant, older, worn, with eyes that have learned not to show anything, drapes another length of fabric across Malini's shoulders. The girl tries to turn her head to ask a question, but the servant's fingers press gently against her chin, returning her face forward. No turning, no questions. This is the first rule she will learn, though no one will speak it aloud. The rules in the zenana are never written. They are known through punishment, through the tightening of a jaw, through the withdrawal of food, through the absence of light. Malini's chambers overlook a walled garden where she will walk, but only between the hours of dawn and mid-morning, and only accompanied. She will not see the city beyond the walls. She will not see her family again for many years, and when she does, the reunion will be formal, supervised, and brief. She will not know the names of most of the 200 other women living in this palace. She will not be allowed to learn to read, though there are thousands of manuscripts in the royal library. She will bear children, and those children will be taken from her, raised by other hands, sleeping in other rooms. She will exist in a space that is neither prison nor sanctuary, a place designed by centuries of tradition to ensure that she remains ornamental, obedient, and powerless. The zenana is not punishment. This is what makes it so precise in its cruelty. It is considered protection. The walls exist to safeguard her chastity, her purity, her honor, concepts that matter far more than her freedom, her happiness, or her will. The rules exist because they have always existed. And Malini, like thousands of women before her and thousands after, will spend her life learning to fade within them. She will learn to move silently through halls where her footsteps echo. She will learn to speak only when spoken to. She will learn to want nothing, expect nothing, be nothing, but the vessel of a lineage that does not belong to her. But this moment, this first moment, sitting in the quiet of her new quarters, the weight of the sari pressing down on her shoulders, the sound of the door closing behind the maidservant, this is when it begins. This is when Malini becomes not a person, but a piece of property, managed according to rules so old and so absolute that they feel like the natural order of the world. She does not yet understand that the dungeon she is about to live in has no visible bars, that the silence will become louder than any scream, that the life she is about to endure is, in the eyes of the empire, not a tragedy, but necessity. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not exaggeration. The brutal system of confinement and control imposed on royal maidens and noble women in ancient and medieval India is documented across centuries of historical records, palace chronicles, legal codes, and eyewitness accounts. Travelers from Persia, Arabia, and Europe left detailed descriptions of these practices. Merchants recorded observations of women locked behind palace walls. Sanskrit texts, Sanskrit-derived legal codes like the Manusmriti and later Rajasthani chronicles detail the rules governing women's lives with cold precision. Archaeological excavations have revealed the architecture of zenanas, the hidden chambers, the small windows overlooking gardens, the locked doors with guards stationed outside.
Temple inscriptions record the dedications of women to religious institutions, often against their will. Royal court records document debates about women's rights and restrictions, written by men who saw no contradiction in treating women as both sacred and subordinate. The evidence comes from multiple traditions. Hindu, Muslim, and Jain kingdoms all practiced variations of strict confinement. Mughal court records describe the purdah system with bureaucratic detail. Portuguese and French travelers, some visiting courts in the 16th and 17th centuries, left accounts of women they were never permitted to meet, but whose muffled voices they heard behind screens. These accounts are not sympathetic to the women. The chroniclers were outsiders observing a system of power, but they are precise. They tell us how many guards, how many locks, how many hours women were permitted in sunlight. What happened if they disobeyed? The sources are fragmented, yes. History seldom centers the experiences of women without power. But when you piece them together, the legal codes, the architectural records, the letters smuggled out of palaces, the later memoirs of women born into confinement, a clear picture emerges. This was not spontaneous cruelty. It was policy. It was tradition. It was justified by religion, by honor, by the logic of bloodlines and inheritance, and it was, for centuries, considered completely normal. To understand the tragedy of Malini and thousands like her, you must first understand the empire she has become a prisoner within. In medieval and ancient India, a woman's value was determined entirely by her sexual purity and her reproductive capacity. These two things were considered intertwined. A woman's chastity was not private or personal. It was a property of the kingdom, inseparable from the legitimacy of heirs, the stability of the throne, and the honor of her family. If a woman was violated, if her purity was compromised, not only was she destroyed, the entire lineage was tainted. The child she bore would be questionable. The inheritance would be questioned. The kingdom's strength would be questioned. In this logic, a woman's body was not hers. It belonged to the state, to her husband, to her son, to the continuity of power. 10. The zenana system emerged as an architectural and social solution to this obsession with control. The term zenana comes from Persian. It means of women, or women's space. But it was far more than a room or a building. It was a complete ecosystem designed to ensure absolute control. Walls, gates, guards, rules about sightlines, rules about who could speak to whom, rules about what constituted loyalty and what constituted dangerous behavior. Some palaces had multiple zenanas, one for the royal wives, another for concubines, another for servants and attendants. Some had a zenana so vast it was like a city within a city, with hundreds of women living in a space they could traverse in their entirety and never once see the outside world. A royal maiden entered this system when she was very young, often in her early teens, sometimes younger. She was sent from her father's palace to her husband's palace, sometimes hundreds of miles away, to a family she had never met, a climate she did not know, a language that might be different from her own. She arrived as a stranger. She remained, for the rest of her life, in many ways, a stranger. Her primary function was to produce an heir. Until she did, she was of limited value. After she did, particularly if the heir was a son, her value was fixed. She had done her duty. Now she had to maintain her silence. The rules of the zenana were enforced by a hierarchy of women. The senior wives, those who had been in the palace longest and had produced sons, held power over the newer arrivals. The mother of the current or future king was the most powerful woman in the zenana, sometimes more influential than the king himself in matters of court succession. Midwives, nurses, and attendants formed a network of surveillance. They watched constantly. They reported everything. If a woman was seen talking to a guard for too long, it was noted.
If a woman was observed looking out a window at the city below, it was noted. If a woman expressed sadness, longing, or any emotion that suggested she was thinking of life outside the walls, it was noted. The system was designed so that women policed women, so that the victims became the architects of each other's imprisonment. The religious justification for this confinement was powerful. Hindu legal codes taught that a woman's dharma, her sacred duty, was obedience to her father, then her husband, then her son. A woman's salvation in the next life depended entirely on her faithfulness and virtue in this one. The Manusmriti, one of the most influential legal texts, stated explicitly that women should never be independent. A woman at home should be under the protection of her father, then under her husband, then under her son. Implicit in this instruction was that she could not be trusted to protect herself. The confinement was therefore not cruelty, but care. The walls were not prisons, but sanctuaries. This rhetorical sleight of hand made the system seem not oppressive, but ordained. Malini wakes before dawn. The sound that wakes her is always the same. The call to prayer from the palace temple, a chant so distant it sounds almost like wind. For a moment, before consciousness fully settles, she forgets where she is. Then she feels the silk against her skin, hears the breathing of the other 3 women who share her chamber, and remembers. She is 14. She will never leave this place. The thought comes to her every morning, like a new discovery, though it has been only 3 weeks. The day is arranged in segments marked by rituals. First, she performs her ablutions in private chambers, using water heated by servants. She is not permitted to see the servants' faces. They are hidden behind screens. Her body is not hers alone. It belongs to the inspection that will come later, the hands of the senior midwife who checks her for signs of illness or, later, pregnancy. She is bathed. Her hair is combed with oil that smells of jasmine and something chemical that makes her throat tight. Her fingernails are checked. Her teeth are examined. She is dressed in a sari appropriate to her rank, different colors assigned to different statuses within the zenana. The wives of the prince wear red silk. The concubines wear yellow. The servants wear undyed cotton. Everyone knows at a glance everyone else's place. By the time the sun rises fully, Malini has been awake for 3 hours and spoken not a single word. Speech is permitted only at certain times, in certain places, with certain people. Casual conversation is discouraged. Gossip forbidden. Laughter is tolerated only in the presence of the senior wives, and only if it seems genuinely spontaneous. Performative laughter is worse than silence, more shameful. She joins the other women in a courtyard for supervised work, embroidery, the preparation of flowers for religious ceremonies, the rolling of betel leaves that the prince will chew. The work is meticulous. Hours pass. No one speaks except in whispers. Beside her, sitting so close their shoulders almost touch, is a woman named Kishori. Kishori arrived at the palace 8 years ago, when she was Malini's age. She has already borne 3 sons. Now, at 22, she is both respected and trapped with a finality that makes her seem older than she is. She moves with a kind of exhausted grace. Her eyes rarely focus on anything. But occasionally, usually in the evening when the guard's attention is elsewhere, she whispers things to Malini. Small, dangerous things. Do not learn the names of the guards. They will use that against you. Do not let them see you cry. Do not make friends. The friendships are safer if they are not observed. Kishori's whispers are an act of rebellion that she seems to understand will be punished if discovered. And yet she does it, perhaps because someone whispered the same things to her 8 years ago, and the chain of resistance, invisible and unbroken, continues. Lunch is served in the hall. Rice, lentils, vegetables prepared without spice, the belief being that spices inflame passions, particularly in women. The water is rationed. The food is eaten silently. Malini, who comes from a merchant family where meals were times of conversation and laughter, has stopped being surprised by the silence. She has learned to eat mechanically, tasting almost nothing. Sometimes she watches the other women's faces and tries to imagine what they are thinking. Some look absent, as if their minds have left their bodies and wandered to some other place. Others look vigilant, calculating, watching the movements of the senior wives the way a bird watches a cat. On the 7th day of the week, there is inspection. The senior midwife moves through the zenana with her assistants, checking each woman privately. Malini stands naked before her, tries not to flinch when the woman's hands move across her body, checking for bruises that might indicate secret liaison, for signs of sickness, for the texture of her skin. The midwife asks questions. When did you last menstruate? Have you had any weakness? Any dizziness? Any unusual thoughts? The questions feel designed to trap her. To answer honestly is to risk being seen as unwell, unstable, potentially contaminated. But to lie is to risk being discovered and punished. Malini has learned to nod slightly, to say very little, to seem serene and empty. The midwife makes notes on a palm leaf. These notes go to the mother of the prince. There is one window in Malini's chamber, small and high, overlooking the garden. She is permitted to stand at this window between dawn and the mid-morning, when the light is brightest and a guard stands directly below. The rule is not stated. The servant simply moves her away if she stands there at other times. But Malini has noticed the pattern. On the 7th morning, she positions herself at this window and looks out at the city she can see beyond the garden walls. The palace sits on an elevated plateau. Beyond it, the Deccan stretches out in waves of red earth and green fields. She can see a river in the distance, so far away it looks like a line drawn in ink. She can see the smoke from cooking fires rising from a village where, at this moment, ordinary women are speaking to their mothers, arguing with their sisters, making choices about their own lives. For 30 seconds, she allows herself to feel something. Not quite pain, more like an absence of pain, a numbness so complete it feels like drowning. Then the guard below shifts his position, reminding her of his presence, and she steps back from the window. The evenings are occupied with small rituals designed to occupy the body while quieting the mind. Women practice classical dance movements, not to perform, but to maintain their bodies in a state of readiness. It is understood, though never stated, that part of their duty is sexual service to the prince or to visiting dignitaries. The dances maintain their flexibility, their beauty, their physical compliance. Some women move through these movements with resignation, others with a kind of deliberate artistry, as if the dance is the only space where they can express something of themselves. A woman named Priya, who shares the zenana with Malini, dances with a fierceness that seems dangerous. Her movements are sharp, aggressive, almost hostile. The senior wives watch her carefully. There is a quality to Priya's dancing that suggests she might break the rules, and broken rules bring consequences for everyone. Darkness comes at the same hour every night. The gates are locked. The guards position themselves outside. Malini lies on her sleeping mat in the dark, listening to the breathing of the other women, the distant sounds of the palace outside. Footsteps, voices of men, the occasional crash of something falling. These sounds represent a whole world she will never enter. Sometimes she hears something that sounds like music from the market, or the calls of street vendors, and it comes like a phantom pain from a limb she no longer has. She closes her eyes and tries to remember her mother's voice, but the memory is fading. In 3 weeks, it has already become unclear. She wonders if this is how it happens, not through a single dramatic event, but through the slow erosion of everything you were, until one day you look back and cannot recognize yourself.
But the confinement of the zenana, however suffocating, was not the deepest violation. The walls in the rules were designed to achieve something more specific: absolute sexual control. A woman's primary duty in the palace was not companionship or love. It was reproduction under absolute conditions of ownership. She was not a wife in any sense that involved consent or equality. She was a vessel. The ceremony that formalized this was the consummation of marriage, a ritual that was not private or intimate, but witnessed, verified, recorded. In some kingdoms, this ritual took place in the presence of senior wives and matriarchs, who inspected the woman afterward to confirm the act had occurred. In others, it was the presence of guards outside locked doors. The message was identical. A woman's body was not her own. Her sexuality was not hers to control. Even in the most intimate moment, she was public property. For Malini, this moment came on the 14th night of her arrival. She was bathed, dressed in a thin white sari, her hair arranged in the style prescribed for the first union. Her mother-in-law, a woman with kind eyes and an iron will, came to her chamber to deliver instructions. Do not resist. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not show fear. Do not show pleasure. Be still. Be compliant. Be grateful. These instructions were not suggestions. They were the conditions of her survival in the palace. As the sun set, Malini sat alone in the chamber and became aware of her own body in a way she had not before, not as something living and hers, but as something that existed to be used. She did not cry. She had learned that tears were a sign of weakness that would be used against her. She sat very still and waited. What followed was not what she had feared, which perhaps was a mercy of its own kind. The prince was young, barely older than her, and seemed as uncomfortable as she was. But discomfort was irrelevant. What mattered was the function. What mattered was that 9 months later, she bore a son. The birth itself was agony. She was young, her body not ready. But the moment the child was placed in her arms, she understood a new form of loss. The son was not hers to keep. He was the property of the kingdom. Within hours, he was taken from her, handed to nurses and tutors who would raise him in the male quarters of the palace. She would see him, occasionally, from a distance. She would never bathe him, never put him to sleep, never hear his first words. Her role was completed. She had done her duty. Now she had to become invisible again. But there were other rituals, less documented but whispered about, that reveal the depths of the system's cruelty. Some women were designated as concubines, not wives, but women brought specifically to service the prince or the king. These women had no status, no rank, no legitimacy. They could be discarded at any time. Some were purchased from families so poor they sold daughters to survive. Others were taken in war, captives with no legal status at all. These women underwent rituals designed to sever them entirely from their previous identity. They were renamed. They were given new histories. Some were tattooed or branded so that even if they escaped, they could be identified as palace property. They lived in separate quarters, their sole purpose to be available whenever they were summoned. The rejection could be sudden and devastating. A woman might be favored for months, given privileges, allowed small autonomies, only to be suddenly sent away or locked in isolation. There were also religious rituals that served the system. Some women, particularly in temples adjacent to palaces, were designated as devadasis, women dedicated to the gods. The religious language suggested honor. The reality was sexual enslavement under the sanctification of religion. These women could not refuse. They could not marry. They were bound to the temple and to whatever acts of service the priest demanded, all justified through sacred law. Similarly, young women were sometimes married to gods,
in elaborate ceremonies that involved the symbolic union of the woman with a deity. After the ceremony, they lived in temple quarters and were considered the god's property. The sexual exploitation that followed was considered worship. The violence was sacred. It was in the 16th month of her confinement that Malini attempted something that would haunt her for the rest of her life: resistance. She had seen Priya, the fierce dancer, exchange a letter with a guard. The letter had been written on a piece of cloth, smuggled past the inspection, hidden in a flower offering. Priya was caught. The punishment was swift. She was moved to an isolated room in the deepest part of the zenana, a place where no one could hear her, where visits were restricted. It was understood, though never stated, that worse things might happen there. But Malini, watching this, felt something crystallize in her, a need to assert that she still existed, that she was still a person capable of choice. One evening, when the opportunity arose, she refused to attend the dance practice. She simply did not appear. She hid in a storage room and sat in complete darkness for hours. The consequences were not dramatic. There was no beating, no visible punishment. Instead, she was called before the senior midwife, questioned about her health, examined to see if she was ill. When she was found to be physically healthy, she was confined to her chamber for a month. During this time, her food was reduced. She was not permitted in the courtyard. She was not allowed to see other women except the servant who brought her meals. No explanation was given. She was not told when the confinement would end. She was simply left to sit in a room, alone, and understand that even this small act of defiance had consequences that could be far worse. By the time the confinement ended, she had stopped thinking of herself as someone who could choose. She had learned the deeper lesson, that real power lies not in dramatic punishment, but in the complete removal of hope that anything you do matters. By the 16th century, a small but growing number of voices within Indian kingdoms began to question the zenana system. These were not the voices of the women trapped inside. They had no platform, no way to speak, but of foreign observers, reformist philosophers, and a handful of royal advisors who saw in the system not tradition, but waste. A Mughal emperor, Akbar, known for his more progressive policies, attempted to restrict the practice of sati, the immolation of widows, and questioned the need for such extreme confinement of women. His reforms were limited. Opposition from conservative religious leaders was immediate and fierce. The restrictions were largely not enforced. After Akbar's death, the practices returned largely unchanged. What his reign demonstrated was that even when a ruler with significant power attempted to address the system, the machinery of tradition was so entrenched, supported by so many religious authorities and powerful families, that reform was nearly impossible. The legal codes themselves became a battleground. Ancient texts like the Manusmriti were invoked to justify the confinement, but other texts offered counter-arguments. The Arthashastra, a political manual, suggested that women could have certain property rights and could even initiate divorce under specific circumstances. These textual ambiguities were never resolved in favor of women. Instead, the most restrictive interpretations were adopted and enforced. When religious councils debated the treatment of women, they did so entirely without the input of women themselves. Men interpreted sacred texts to justify male authority, and the result was a legal system that had no mechanism for women to challenge their own oppression. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers gained influence in India, criticism of the zenana system intensified from outside. British colonial officers found the practice shocking and used it as justification for their civilizing mission, a deeply problematic argument that ignored the oppressions built into their own system. Indian reformers, particularly in the 19th century, began to speak out. Ram Mohan Roy, a Bengali reformer, wrote against sati and advocated for women's education. He was met with fierce resistance from Orthodox Hindu leaders who saw any change in women's status as a threat to the entire social structure. The debates that followed reveal the core truth of the system, that the subjugation of women was understood as essential to the stability of society itself. But laws and debates mattered very little to the women living in the zenanas. By the time these conversations were happening, thousands of women had already lived and died in confinement. New laws that offered limited rights, permission to own property, or to initiate divorce, did not apply to those in royal palaces, where custom superseded civil law. The zenana system persisted, becoming gradually less visible as the 20th century progressed, but not truly ending. Some women gained freedom through education and modernization. Others remained imprisoned in tradition, now further hidden by the claim that the system no longer existed. Though sati had been formally outlawed in 1829, the government of India, after independence, passed additional laws restricting widow burning and attempted to dismantle the zenana system. Yet the system itself was never explicitly banned. It was simply allowed to fade, replaced by more subtle forms of control. Family honor, social pressure, economic dependence, and the continuation of arranged marriage without consent. What the historical record shows is this. Every moment a system of oppression is challenged, the powerful respond not with evidence, but with claims about tradition, nature, religion, and stability. They argue that change will destroy everything. They invoke the past as a justification for the present. And they ensure that those who suffer have no voice in the conversation about their own suffering. The women inside the zenanas never debated policy. They never submitted testimony. They lived and died as the issue was discussed by men who would never experience their condition. Even when reforms were passed, those who benefited were often the privileged. Elite women might gain access to education. Royal women might receive slightly more freedom. The thousands of women without status, the concubines and servants and temple dancers, remained invisible. This was not chaos. It was policy. The zenana system was not an aberration or a dark chapter in an otherwise noble history. It was the logical extension of a belief system that treated women as resources to be controlled. Every wall, every rule, every ritual was designed with precision. The bureaucracy that maintained it was sophisticated. The justifications for it were elaborate. We call this a dark period of history. But to those who benefited from the system, to the men who secured their lineages, to the priests who sanctified the practice, to the families who gained status through advantageous marriages, it was simply the world as it was. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth about atrocity. It is never experienced as atrocity by those who wield power. The deeper truth is this. Civilization is measured not by its monuments, not by its art, not by the brilliance of its philosophy, but by how it treats those with no power. The palaces of Vijayanagara were architectural marvels. The courts produced poets and scholars. The temples held treasures. But within those same walls, generation after generation of women lived in confinement, their youth consumed by waiting, their minds dulled by silence, their identities erased by design. This was not an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise enlightened system. This was the system. The beauty of the palace and the brutality of the zenana were not contradictions. They existed together. They depended on each other. If you visit India today, you can still see the ruins of these palaces. Tourists walk through courtyards where women once moved in carefully prescribed patterns. They look at the frescoes and the carved ceilings and imagine the splendor of court life. Few are told about the zenana. Few pause to consider the silence that those walls once contained. The architecture remains, but the suffering has been forgotten, buried under centuries, and rewritten into legend.
Guides tell stories of great kings and glorious empires. The women, the thousands of them, become footnotes. When they are mentioned at all, they are often romanticized. The devoted wives, the tragic lovers, the keepers of tradition. The violence is softened. The confinement is reframed as protection. The erasure of their personhood is called honor. But Malini was not a legend. She was a girl who lost her freedom at 14. She was a woman who bore a son she could not raise. She was a person who was taught that her suffering was natural and right and necessary. She lived the rest of her life inside walls, not because she was weak, but because the system was designed to make her weak, to make anyone weak, to transform strong people into compliant vessels. And when she died, no one marked her passing. Her name was not recorded in histories. She became one of thousands whose lives were consumed by a system that erased them while they were still alive. Here is what I want you to consider. What systems in our world operate on the same logic? What institutions exist to control and diminish those with no power, justified by tradition and covered in the language of protection and honor? How many women and girls today live behind invisible walls as suffocating as the zenana? How many are told that their confinement is for their own good? How many have learned not to expect freedom because the world has taught them that compliance is the only path to safety? We like to think that the horrors of the past are history, that we have progressed beyond them. But the architecture of oppression changes form. It does not disappear. It hides better. It justifies itself more subtly. The women in the palaces of ancient India cannot speak to us now. They are gone. But their silence is not permission to forget. If you believe their stories matter, if you believe that uncomfortable truths are more important than comforting myths, that the powerless deserve to be remembered, then subscribe. Share this. Tell someone else about Malini and Kishori and Priya and the thousands whose names we will never know. Do not let their erasure be complete. Do not let their suffering be folded into the narrative of a glorious civilization. Stand witness to what happened in the darkness of those walls. And ask yourself, what suffering are we ignoring in our own time, hidden behind walls we do not think to question?